My guest today is Professor Martha Minow, who is Professor of Law at Harvard University. She has taught at Harvard Law School since 1981 and served as Dean between 2009 and 2017. Her prior books include Saving the News, Why the Constitution Calls for Government Action to Preserve the Freedom of Speech, 2021, When Should Law Forgive, 2019, in Brown's wake, Legacies of American Constitutional Landmark, 2010, Partners, Not Rivals, Privatization and the Public Good, 2002, and Between Vengeance and Forgiveness, Facing History After Genocide and Mass Violence, 1998. Welcome, Martha.
Thank you. It's very good to be here.
Yeah, that's a lot of writing.
I'm old. I've been around.
In very, very interesting topics. I mentioned, Martha, I don't have a deep background in these topics, but I'm very, very interested in them. So I want to start with your memorial lecture at University of California, Berkeley, that just happened in March of this year. And I just want to read a little bit from the abstract, and then we can just talk about it. So you say here, beneath growing perceptions of constitutional crisis and democratic fragility in the United States lies a fundamental conundrum. Critical preconditions for effective self-government are either weak or missing in action. And our constitutional system, at least for now, stands in the way of actions to strengthen or build those preconditions. So let's talk a little bit about this precondition. So you have sort of three different preconditions you list here. You want to start there?
Absolutely. Thank you. And I'm sure there are more preconditions, but I identify three to really shed light on a particular feature of the U.S. Constitution, which is it's often described as a negative liberty constitution. It sets restrictions on what government can do while setting up the mechanisms of government. Compare that with most post-World War II constitutions for democracies. They have affirmative rights that the government will guarantee. And it has struck me, and that's why I gave that talk, that some of the elements that are necessary to make the mechanisms of government work are either decayed or absent. And yet we have a government that is restricted in what it can do affirmatively. And so I do identify three as examples. One is education, equal opportunity for quality education. A second is access to reliable information, news media. And the third is physical safety, and I focus there on guns and gun control. Yeah. And in each of those areas, we have real restrictions on what at least the federal government is allowed to do.
Yeah, this negative liberty idea is very interesting. I haven't really thought about it. So is this specific to the United States? I know that, we don't want the government to do anything. And anytime they try to do something, there's a big uproar against it. And, as I mentioned, Martha, I grew up in India. And when the founders set it up in 1947, the Constitution was very, how should I say it, secular and democratic, and really sort of egalitarian.
Yes.
In many ways. So those were the foundational principles. And to the extent that we have time, we want to talk a little bit about, India went through an election just recently.
Yes,
and things have changed quite dramatically there since 2014. Just like in the US, things have changed quite dramatically since 2016. So two of these large democracies have gone through some phenomenal shifts. Yes. In some direction, right? So where are we in the US on that dimension?
It's a very interesting contrast with India. I'm not an expert, but just as an example, the Indian Constitution has a right to education, free education for all children. Our Constitution in the United States does not. And I participated in efforts to try to argue that you can find it in our Constitution, and they have been resoundingly rejected. So that's a difference. One thing that may be somewhat similar is that both constitutions are committed to freedom of expression, including freedom of media. And yet in both societies, there is enormous growth in disinformation and misinformation, and perhaps even government actors involved in generating or permitting its growth. And if you have, as we do in the United States, a set of rules that say hands off government, it's very hard to tackle that problem. And it's becoming harder as it is affected by the digital environment and social media and bots that create misinformation, disinformation, and propagate it and escalate it. And yet I understand the challenge, because if the government is involved in setting up the information environment, that also is a problem. And we have seen that in India. So,
right.
Yes.
Yeah, so there's a second aspect here, reliable news. So it's a slippery slope, right? As you say, as technology accelerates, government may not have the competence to really do anything in the news arena, right? I mean, they can't really control it. So then the question is the society sort of going to step up to do that in the absence of the government intervention? And that is a very problematic situation, right? I mean, what are thoughts on this?
Well, I certainly don't want any government actors deciding what is the news, who reports the news, what point of view to have about the news. However, you mentioned government intervention. The government fingerprints are all over the news ecosystem in the United States. The rules about antitrust and who can own what and who can't own what. The rules about distribution, whether it's the cable systems, or for that matter, even the subsidies that the post office gives to news media. The creation of the technologies used in our media systems. The government financed the internet, the development of it. The government financed, for example, the algorithm that is behind Google. That was a National Science Foundation funded project. And going earlier, the government subsidized the development of radio and television and also telegraph. So the government has a role. And the question is, for what purpose? I think it should stay clear of anything that has to do with content decisions. But the rules about access, and even take a hotly contested question, which is net neutrality. Should there be differential charges for access to the internet based on the identity of the supplier of the content? That's been a political football in administrations in the United States. There's no neutrality about neutrality. You either are for it or you're against it. The government is taking a position.
Right. So let me ask you sort of a very tactical question. So we won't mention any names here. So very recently, the CEO of a social media company posted online sort of electronically altered speech of a presidential candidate. And the policy of the platform is that they don't publish electronically, changed content.
Altered, yeah.
And what the CEO is saying is that, hey, look, this is obviously parody. I mean, come on, don't you guys know it? And so expose, you say, well, this is so obvious. I mean, what is the problem here? So where do you stand on something like that?
Lies, propaganda, misrepresentation probably have been around as long as human beings have been around. What's different now is that we have technologies that make it hard for us to use our senses to test what we see. And deep fakes is a great example. They're getting better and better and better and harder to determine. I don't know about that particular example, whether it was hard to determine or not. The problem that you identify is a wicked problem, because on the one hand, it's a private platform. And the decisions about what goes on or doesn't go on are themselves given First Amendment protection, because those are editorial decisions. even if they're made by an algorithm, they are set up by human beings. And the United States Supreme Court has been very clear that the editorial judgments about what is featured and what is not are given First Amendment protections. So that's a problem on this side. On the other side, there are the difficulties of the users of these platforms who are subject to fraud, misrepresentation, consumer protection violations, and who've signed terms of service agreements that guarantee that they will have protections against those features. So the government is back in the picture because the government sets up those rules and decides whether or not to enforce them or how to enforce them. And then you add to it, it's just really hard to detect increasingly these deep fakes. And even when you detect them and take them down, they then are circulating on another site. They crop up somewhere else. The escalation, the speeding up of the circulation of content, that is altered the situation. So what my own view is, there should be terms of service agreements. I believe that the government actually can and should require private entities to explain how they are protecting users. And if they want to say in their terms of service agreements, we don't protect them, so be it. But if they say they protect users, then those should be enforced.
Yeah, so then there are sort of antitrust concerns here too. So suppose, the 5 out of the, I don't know how many billionaires or trillionaires we have, but the top 5 guys go and buy the 5 dominant social media platforms.
Yes.
And let's say I don't want to use the term collude, but let's say they sort of talk with each other to figure out what content they want to publish. You could very, very easily manipulate elections. You could pretty much take this thing to anywhere, right? So what protections do we have?
Actually, we don't have to go to social media platforms or anything fancy to see the problem. In many parts of this country, the only news source available is Fox News. And Fox News is old-fashioned broadcast, radio, television. They do have cable, obviously. So I would ask, why are they the only provider that's available in many communities? There's a similar problem on the radio side of Sinclair is the owner, the dominant owner in many, many, many markets. That's an antitrust problem. That's a problem for just old-fashioned antitrust law. And I think that the United States government has been asleep at the switch.
So who would be responsible for implementing antitrust in these cases?
Yeah, interestingly, Antitrust Authority is given both to the federal government and to the states. And actions can be initiated by the government, but they also can be initiated by competitors or private users. So there can be an initiation of investigations. They haven't always gone well. The many, many decades litigation against AT&T ultimately produced a breakup of Bell Industries that then reorganized as Verizon. And it's not clear anybody was better off. So I think that there's a kind of sobered view that breakup is not necessarily the best remedy. But if you find a violation, not just of pricing, but of the benefit to consumers, which these are the tests that stems from the market dominant position of an actor, there can be other remedies. There could be remedies that are either agreed to by a settlement or that actually are issued by a court. But let me back up for a minute. With social media platforms, we have a problem that the current federal antitrust law treats the price to consumers as the critical measure. And guess what? It's free. There is no price.
It's zero price. Yeah.
There's no price. Of course, there's a price, which is our data, but the government doesn't treat that as a price.
Right. Yeah. So have we gone, so old-fashioned news, as you said, I remember, my grandfather, as I mentioned, was in the state assembly right after Indian independence. By the time I was born, he was out of the political stuff. He was a high school headmaster, but he used to listen to BBC News.
Uh-huh.
And so I used to sit with him to listen to BBC News. And BBC News is a government funded entity. But the way that they approach news in the 70s and 80s, we don't have anything like that anymore, I think. I don't see it in the US. PBS,
So,
perhaps. Yeah, I know that you sit on the board of PBS, but yeah.
yeah, so I do sit on the board of our local public media. It's called GBH based in Boston, which is the developer of about a quarter of the content that appears in public media in the United States. Unlike Britain, Japan, some other countries, when the United States was organizing its access to the limited airwaves, the spectrum, it did not set aside government or public media. Britain did. So did Japan. And they also set up rules to make sure that those in power in the government were not picking the content.
Yeah.
The United States took a while, but in the mid 60s started to realize, oh, we should have done that, and created public media. This really led to requirements of the creation of television sets that had VHS, so there'd be more channels. Now with cable, it looks quaint. We have lots of channels. But similarly, we're concerned about government control of content and carefully created the Corporation for Public Broadcasting that then funds the public broadcasting system, which in turn funds individual stations and producers. Many, many, many steps. So the government is not in control of the content.
So PBS, this is over the air transmission, right?
I'm sorry.
It's over the air.
Yes,
Yeah.
It's not only, it's over the air, but these days it's internet as well.
Yeah. So why did you say Fox News has sort of a dominant position in a lot of the local markets? Well, why is PBS not there?
Such a good question. The most trusted part of the news ecosystem historically in the United States is local news. It's also the bleeding edge of what is dying in markets, open markets. And it's pretty simple to explain why. Local news was funded historically in this country by buyers of subscriptions or individual newspapers, and by ads. And it turns out, compare that with the social media market, you don't have to pay anything.
Yeah.
And the ads have moved there. So we've lost what was a virtuous ecosystem, so that the ads for news paid for more news. And instead we have ads that are on social media. Social media is not in the news business.
Yeah.
And, some of the news outlets have tried to use the platforms, but mostly it's distributed by third parties, by you and I sending something to a friend. That's where most of it is shared, and there's nobody paying for it. And that's a major problem in terms of how do you pay for more news, more investigation. At this moment, if you went to a state Supreme Court or a state legislature, there probably are no journalists covering it. If you go to local criminal courts, there are no journalists covering it. One thing we know for sure, when no one's watching, corruption happens.
Yes.
And this is true for private power, not just government power. Those communities that have lost their local news outlets, which is now happening at a rate of 2.5 a week in this country, have increases in corruption by government actors, increases in corruption by private actors, and decreases in voting. So it's a major problem. But finding a way to finance local news provision, it doesn't scale. So it's a big problem. You asked about public media. If we actually added up all of the journalists, reporters, producers who are employed by or somehow contribute content through public media, that would be the biggest local news operator in the country, but they don't operate that way. They operate individually.
Yeah, so it's an economic problem that is not
Yes.
easily solved. But I want to
Yes.
touch back on education again. So it's a little bit of a tangent, Martha. But so everybody goes into, not everybody, but a large percentage of the people go into STEM education. And one could argue that with artificial intelligence and technology accelerating, a lot of the STEM jobs could be completely automated away in the future. And so, do education systems have to really think about sort of redesigning perhaps journalism, where you need a lot of creativity and a lot of what's the right term? I mean, to go in and
Brain
look at
share.
things more critically.
Yes.
Yeah. So should the education systems be thinking about retuning what they what they're focused on?
It's a profound question. It's really what I think is going to challenge education delivery, whether it's kindergarten through high school or higher ed, more profoundly than anything since the creation of the book.
Yeah.
The creation of the book was a revolution. This is a revolution. We each can have in our pocket access to all the world's knowledge that's ever been digitized. So access to knowledge is not quite the point. And as you say, the job situation is enormously in flux. Journalism itself, there are more and more possibilities of whether it's sports or elections, the basic facts being provided by an AI generated content. I do believe that there's an obligation for not just those in education, but for politicians and for citizens to be asking, what should we be seeking in our schooling and in education? I think that there's no excuse at this moment, precisely because of the technological changes, for the vast disparities in access to quality, because now it's possible to put together great lectures and individualized tutoring by human beings or even by AI for each student. And so we should absolutely do that. And I hope the result would be to unlock more creativity, more opportunity. You point out the STEM students trend, which is a big deal in universities like my own. I think one of the very important activities is to make sure that every student, no matter what they are focused on, also learn about government, learn about civics, learn about art, learn about wars, learn about empathy for people unlike themselves. And, I actually teach a class right now, co-teach it with a colleague in computer science, half law students, half computer scientists, because we are so convinced that they're going to work with each other the minute they graduate. We need to find ways for them to communicate while they're in school. And here's something that surprised me. All the computer science students say the topics that we're raising about fairness and privacy and accountability, they do not encounter in any of their CS classes. That's troubling to me.
Yeah, I don't know about that. Maybe it's slightly different culture, possibly. So maybe they're not picking up on it. I don't know. So in some sense, the precondition, so I want to touch on the third precondition, which is security against lethal violence. But in some sense, if I understand this correctly, Martha, there are preconditions within education. Within the bucket of education, there are certain preconditions that to make it optimum, so to speak, right? So do we have some good models, let's say more, maybe it's controversial, but let's say more developed countries like Japan or Scandinavia? Do we have better models?
Well, there certainly are greater successes in the project of universal education in Scandinavia than in the United States, where our disparities are so gross and extreme. I don't think it's just test scores, but that's not a bad measure of, basic competence in literacy and mathematics. I mean, in India, Kerala, the literacy rates are so impressive, even in impoverished parts of the state. So it's doable. There are models for sure.
Yeah.
If the federal government in this country is not going to guarantee, and it is not, access to minimum education, nor even finding some minimum threshold of expenditures. Thank goodness we do have states. And almost all of the states in the United States have a state constitutional guarantee of education. So finding ways to actually make sure that that promise is realized has been a project. It is a project, and some states are doing better than others. Fascinating to me, probably the most effective educational system in the United States, other than some private schools, is run by the U.S. military. So the U.S. military runs K through 12 schools in the United States and around the world for the children of people in the military. It also, of course, has a major education program for people in the military. But there are three things that they have that our educational systems in the United States otherwise don't have. One is a commitment to mastery, no matter what.
Yeah.
Everybody can learn. We'll figure out how to make sure that they learn. Number two, because the parents are in the military schools can actually make it part of the parents' job that they have to show up at parent-teacher conferences, participate in the homework, etc. We don't have that ability in a free society to require parents to participate. And frankly,
democracy has some downside, so to speak.
It does. But frankly, it's as much to make sure that there's time in their day. You think about recent immigrants who are working 3 jobs. No one's looking at whether they can participate in their children's education. The third thing that the U.S. military schools have that I think is so interesting is that they have a sense of we. They have a sense that we are a community, we are committed to this project together, and that's unfortunately been missing in many parts of the country. And right now with polarization, it's terrible. And schooling is one of the topics in the crosshairs of the polarized political fights. What can be taught, what can't be taught, what books are allowed, what not. So rather than uniting around the project of preparing the next generation to manage the issues that AI is bringing to us, that the environmental disasters are bringing, instead we're sniping at each other, and it's tragic.
Yeah, I mean, it's a threat to democracy in some sense, right? I think you talk about this in the paper. Unless you have good information and you have education to analyze emerging information, how can you make decisions in a democratic system?
It is such a bold bet, democracy, government by the people, self-government. It's a kind of crazy idea, but all the others are not so good. The problem is, if you do not equip the people to be able to take up this big responsibility, it will fail.
Right. Yeah, so there's some big threats to democracy all around the world, as you have talked about. And so I want to touch on the security against lethal violence, the third sort of axis that you talk about here. So what do you mean by that?
I've agreed to write a book about this, and this is an issue that some of the reviewers of the proposal raised a great serious questions about. Why is this in the collection of preconditions, and what do we mean by it? Any society needs safety and security against violence to survive. The particular focus that I'm interested in related to democracy and its jeopardy is that 80+% of Americans want sensible gun control.
Yeah.
The gap between that desire and the reality has a lot to do with the way we've set up our system. We have a Second Amendment that protects the right to bear arms. Relatively recently, the United States Supreme Court ruled that that applies to individuals rather than what had been the interpretation for over 100 years, that it only applied to groups, to militia, to those that were serving the government. And most recently, the Supreme Court has weaponized, hate to use the term, but I can't resist, that Second Amendment to strike down all kinds of gun control. There was a kind of reprieve in June when the Supreme Court decided 8-1 that a federal law removing guns from someone who is subject to a protection order due to domestic violence, that is lawful under the Second Amendment. But here's the kicker. They decided at 8-1. There were 7 opinions out of 9 justices. They are jockeying for disagreeing of positions about how to interpret the Second Amendment, looking ahead. It's a mess. And one of the opinions by Justice Jackson, who most recently was on an appellate court and before that a district court, she says the judges below have no idea what to do. 7 opinions with different rulings. And if they don't know what to do, what can legislators do? People who are listening to the community saying, please come up with sensible gun control. How can they do that against this backdrop? So that's, for me, an example of how the basic task of government to assure the security of human beings is a precondition to participate in a democracy is to believe that the democratic government can deliver on that. And there's a good reason for people not to believe that right now.
Yeah, I mean, in some sense, it's common sense, right? So Australia went through some difficulty, and they said, this doesn't make any sense. We're just going to take all the guns out of the system.
They did.
And they implemented it. It didn't take,
it wasn't rocket science, wasn't that hard. And, if you go to Detroit, Michigan, and go across the border to Windsor, Canada, you wouldn't know you had crossed the country other than the border crossing. There's a McDonald's. It all looks very similar. The trees are similar, but they don't have gun violence because they have different rules.
Yeah. Yeah, it's strange. When I was growing up, I never seen a gun except in perhaps movies. Even in movies, there weren't any guns, if I remember correctly. But since then,
we have more than 400 million guns in circulation in the United States, which is more than 1 per person.
Yeah, I thought it was 2 per person, Martha.
I think it is close to 2 per person. And the leading cause of death for people under 18, for children, is gun violence.
Yeah.
Though some of that is suicide.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I want to sort of conclude on this. So these 3 axes, it seems pretty important. Education, without that, you can't really analyze data and make the right decisions. You need data, which is reliable news, to do that. And then you need security to actually function. One thing I was thinking about, Martha, would you consider healthcare to be an axis in this?
It's such a very thoughtful question. When South Africa was writing its constitution after the fall of apartheid, they debated exactly that. And instead, they asserted a right to health rather than health care. And interestingly, I had the chance to talk with some of the drafters at that time, and they explained that, it might be more important to work on the purification of the water for health than it is tertiary care hospitals. So thinking about that general area from a public health perspective seems to me very sensible as a policy matter. In terms of fundamental constitutional rights, I'm a product of the United States. It seems kind of extraordinary. Well, why not food then? Why not housing? Why not one after another? All the things that we need to live. And I hope that what we instead do is create a government that's responsive enough to the people who want those qualities.
Yeah, so I was sort of expanding security in a larger sense. So healthcare, housing, unless you can securely function in a country, you can't really go anywhere, right? So is security in a larger sense a function of what the government should be thinking.
I have no doubt it's a function of the government. I'm not so sure it's a precondition of a constitutional society. It's
Yep.
interesting you should say this. Amartya Sen, great philosopher, led a commission for the UN on human security. And in that commission, they defined security just the way you've described it, very broadly, with what we would think about as these affirmative guarantees.
Yeah.
But it's not about how do you set up a government, which is what a constitution is.
Yeah, yeah. So I want to go into another paper. So this is another talk that you're given, Justice in Divided Societies. And it's very topical. Work against injustice, don't demonize your enemies, you say here. Can both of these views be right? I suggest the answer is yes, and indeed, urgently so. My exploration focused on finding durable approaches to injustice and deep conflicts. Yeah, I have grown rather pessimistic over the last 10 years, I would say, Martha. So how can we integrate these two things?
Yes. I was very drawn to this topic in part because of work I've done in post-conflict societies, former Yugoslavia, Rwanda. I didn't expect to have these issues in my backyard, in my country, and yet I think they're here. When people turn to violence, when they don't like the results of an election, violence when they disagree about what should happen on a campus. We are living in a very divided time. I do think that there has to be the development of a capacity in human beings to hold conflicting thoughts in our minds at the same time. We should work against injustice. But in doing so, the risk is that we demonize people who disagree with us.
Yeah.
And the problem with that is that sets in motion the vicious cycle of, well, then we can do anything against them. We can bring arms against them. So that's why I wrote that paper and trying to develop what seems like common sense. We should be able to disagree even about what we feel passionately without turning the others on the other side as they are lesser. And I say that quite specifically. There's a story that haunts me. The man who had Doctors Without Borders in Rwanda at the time of the genocide, a man named Dr. James Orbinski, tells about knowing that the killing was coming. He went to the head of a hospital and he said, could we please move the children so they're not at risk? And the head of the hospital was resistant. So Dr. Orbinski said, are you a parent? And the head of the hospital said, well, yes, and showed the pictures of his children. Dr. Orbinski says, well, these tutus, these are children as well. And the head of the hospital said, no, they're not. They're insects. They're cockroaches. That's the tendency that is associated with war, with genocide, with mass violence. It's to deny the humanity of people you disagree with or who are from a group that's not your group. And that's where we just have to say, no, that's not allowed.
Yeah, so, I used to call this sort of a club effect, which is in AI, we have this concept of reinforcement learning.
Yes.
So if I am in a club and all the people around me think the same way and, have the same ideas, my brain is going to have reinforced in certain way. And it's very difficult to get out of it once you're in there, right? So, so that, if you think about a solution, we know that we are very divided right now. When I go on social media and I, sort of read what people say or do, they are either coming from the left or the right. That's it. I mean, there is really no negotiation there about anything.
I have the same experience, and yet what's striking to me is people who are much more involved in the research end of this than I am point out that it's a limited number of people who are posting. And most of the people who are reading do not have those views. You can find from opinion polls and so forth. And so again, it goes to the design, the architecture of these platforms. Why is that what escalated? Why is that what is circulating? Some of it is human, brains. That's the rubbernecking effect. We turn when we see something terrible. We are more likely to forward to someone else an outrageous post than one that is not outrageous. But the big social media platforms actually reward outrage, because what they care the most about is engagement, how long people stay on. Well, that's appealing to our lizard brain, not our thought brain. And, that's a design choice. It doesn't have to be that way.
Yeah, so this goes to, the same sort of monopoly effect on social media. So it's not only sort of you have a large share of the population on it, just reading, they're not really posting. And you want those eyeballs to stay because ads are on the right-hand side, scrolling. And so you sort of reward people saying the extreme things in some sense, right? That's what's going on, you think?
I do think that there's a reward for extreme statements, for outrageous activities. And, social media platforms employ psychologists who study what will keep people engaged. I think there are choices to be made. I would love it if markets could show that people would prefer something else. At the moment, that's not working so well. But I think your reinforcement learning point is such an important one, and it's why diversity of content is so important for machine learning, for generative AI, for education, for news ecosystems. When we were talking a moment ago about the importance of education, it's not simply so people can assess information. It's also so people can empathize. Yeah. People can imagine themselves in someone else's shoes. So they've read a short story and they can imagine what it's like to grow up in a very different culture, and also to learn about different cultures and to learn that people really are not so different in fundamental ways, but they have other differences. I mean, that's as important in education as math.
Very true. So I'm seeing research on this, Martha, but do you think there's sort of a threshold percentage of people? I don't know how to really think about this. So you take 8 billion people, and let's say, at some point we're going to get 6 billion of them are sort of on one side of the room, and 3 billion on one side of the room and the 3 billion on the other side of the room. And the other 2 billion is sort of giving up because they can't really engage with these people. Do you think we are heading toward a world like that? In which case, it's very, very difficult to come back from that, I would think, right?
I'm really worried about it. I am spending the summer reading about the decline of the Roman Empire. Not that I want to bring it back in particular, but also learning about how many empires there have been and how many wars there have been. And human beings are capable of terrible, terrible violence. The Crusades, what people do in the name of, beliefs. I don't want to be an alarmist, but I worry about it. And I think most people don't want that. And so how do we create the preconditions for people to actually coexist and to find ways to collaborate around things that they do care about? I had the good fortune to work with the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. We created a project called Imagine Coexistence. And our idea was that, loving each other is too tall a goal, but coexisting, maybe that's something we can work on. And how do we create the community center, the shared threshing machine, the infrastructure so that different communities can actually coexist?
Yeah, so I want to a little bit of a tangent, but I want to ask you about this. So religion. And so we have, sort of two democracies now, a large one in India, started off as secular democratic nation, around 2014, seemed to have gone in a different direction.
Yes.
And the very recent election, the dog whistle was they want to get 75% of the legislative seats so that they can change the constitution. make India a Hindu country was the goal. Fortunately for the
They
country,
failed.
it
They
didn't happen.
failed. Yes. Democracy worked, actually.
Barely, I would say.
Yes, I know.
And we are in sort of a similar situation here, right? So I saw a senator from Kansas saying, if you're asking me, is this a Christian country? I'm going to say, yes, it is. And so there is a real push toward the US is really a Christian country. And the Project 2025 is sort of in that angle, right?
No question about it. And whatever one's view is on about abortion as a politics, there's no question there's a religious dimension to the legal treatments of it. And we have a supermajority on the Supreme Court who are members of one religion, not just even one Christian religion, they're Catholics. That is extraordinary, since there are more Muslims in the United States than there are Episcopalians. I mean, it's an astonishing phenomenon. You know, Turkey is another example of a country that had a secular commitment in its constitution and has been taken in another direction. We have at least one candidate in the presidential race in the United States who recently made remarks to Christians, you don't have to worry, you don't even have to vote again. And I assume that was saying we're gonna be a Christian country. You know, religion is such a perfect example for the reason I gave that particular speech about justice in divided societies, because people feel understandably committed to their religions, righteous about it, source of beliefs, source of practices that are fundamental. And yet, you know, religion has been weaponized and has been the basis of violence throughout human history. So it's ironic because every religion has some version of respect the other, engage in forgiveness, avoid violence, and yet it has actually given rise to great violence. So I actually try to look for resources across different belief systems, whether they are religious or secular, and find the overlap and appeal to what might be just everyone's self-interest of how can we get along.
Yeah, so there's a sort of an old-fashioned question here again, Martha. So as I mentioned, I grew up in the southern part of India. The state that I grew up, you know, it was almost equally divided between Muslims, Christians, and Hindus. I grew up as a Catholic there, which is a small percent of India's population. We also had 5% Jewish population there at some point.
Sure, long-standing Jewish population. I'm Jewish. Yeah.
And you know, so we used to go to every festival, you know, temples, mosques, churches. There was no real religious issue. We had 100% literacy. So this goes back into sort of educational question. So does society require some level of threshold education for it to sustain itself? I think it's a question, right? Some sense.
I do, and I do think that there may be some other pathways to having empathy and understanding and not demonizing others, but education seems to be an awfully good one. And, you know, there are other places and times that have experiences very much like what you remember from your childhood, you know, Cordoba, Spain, in the medieval era, Christians, Muslims, Jews actually wrote poetry next to each other. They collaborated. And, you know, that was a golden era. That was a golden era of Spain, and it was a golden era of poetry, actually. So I think we all can look at these circumstances and see that there are reasons to have hope. Human beings are capable of not only coexisting, but thriving across difference. And we're talking about the difficulties that come with reinforcement learning and narrow casting, and you need some exposure to people who have a different point of view and remind you, oh, it could be different.
Yeah, being an engineer, Martha, I think of society is becoming more brittle. We are losing flexibility. The risk of that is when something that's really brittle falls, it's going to shatter.
It's so
And
funny
yeah,
you should say this because
yeah.
I have spent, the last 20 years thinking about the concept of forgiveness as one of those concepts that are across different religions and secular belief systems. And, forgiving, a material science would uses the word forgiving for a material that is not brittle, that can move with the wind, that can adjust to circumstances. And I think there's lots to learn from that, the tall tree that can move in the wind. And forgiveness is one of the critical ingredients for human beings, or for that matter, large mammals, to coexist. And it's not by accident that it's been cultivated across systems. When you don't have it, you have a brittleness. And let me turn the table back to you. Do you think that technologies are capable of leaving room for forgiveness? Or is there a risk of so perfecting the proper, correct answer that there will be no give in the joints?
Yeah, so we want to talk about the other. So, my view, Martha, is that especially this generative AI, the AI wave that we are on today, it's fundamentally using historical data. So in some sense, we are in a loop. We use historical data. It sort of puts out some conclusions based on historical data. That data then becomes raw material for further predictions and classifications.
Pattern recognition.
Yeah, and then so that is a prescription for reinforced brittleness, in the sense that you just use the same thing over and over again, and whatever you have created and you thought was new was actually based on the previous thing. And so there was I don't know if you saw this, that there was a program, there's an AI program that was put into a New York hospital system. This was like 5 years ago. And they came up with a prediction that African Americans require less care. That's because history says African Americans got less care, right? So you just let that process continue through generative
Yes.
AI and other mechanisms, and there is only one outcome for that, right? So yeah, I really do worry about.
I worry about
that.
this.
Yeah.
I have another
Yeah.
example, which is, many court systems in the United States are now using algorithms to predict who will not turn up for a court hearing and therefore should be detained pre-trial. And they're racially disparate results, massively disparate results. Well, one reason, when you unpack it, is they have as one of the factors, and this isn't fancy generative AI, it's just statistics. They have as one of the factors likelihood of arrest. Well, likelihood of arrest, guess what, is a function of where the police are sent. And the police are sent into traditionally, historically Black neighborhoods, neighborhoods of Hispanics and Blacks. So unless you have someone with a critical eye looking at what the inputs are, we will become very brittle and we will do great harm.
Yeah, that brings memories, Martha. I spent some time in Hyde Park, outside of Chicago, in the 90s.
Yes.
I couldn't go
I'm
anywhere
from Chicago, so yes.
without cops, yeah. And so I want to touch on another paper, Equality, Equity, and Algorithms, Learning from Justice, Rosalie Abella. So you say here in the United States, employers, schools, and governments can face two competing legal requirements regarding racial classifications. On the one hand, there are legal restrictions against conscious uses of racial classifications. And on the other hand, there are rules forbidding racially disparate impacts. So this is a very complex problem, isn't it? So how do you think we should think about this and potentially solve it?
Oh, thanks for reading that paper. I wrote it in honor of great justice from Canada, Justice Rosalie Abella, as she was stepping down from their court. By the way, they have an age limit, unlike the United States.
Yes. Biden has just proposed it, but I don't think it's going to go anywhere. Yeah.
He has indeed, and term limits. And I became extremely interested in the differences between how Canada and the United States deal with this question of color blindness, group categorization. And Justice Abella really personally pioneered a conception that says we want to make sure that we aren't exacerbating the disadvantages in society, which means that we'll at times have to look and be race conscious. And we want to look at whether at the end of the day or the end of the program, at the end of the hiring process, people have actual equal opportunities. And if that means we're going to be gender conscious, race conscious, then we should do that. The United States is on a different path. We have a statute, for example, with regard to employment discrimination that does look at disparate outcomes in terms of statistical patterns in employment. But we have a constitutional law that is saying quite explicitly that any government actor cannot look and cannot use race. And indeed, many private actors cannot either, like private universities. Well, these are on a collision course with each other, and they're on a collision course that's of our own making, because we could adopt the framework that Canada has, and we don't need to be on that path. You know, it's a particular problem. I hope it's being resolved for developers of software who don't want to have, for example, racially disparate outcomes. So they are testing while developing. Is this working? Is this not working? Well, under at least the thinking that's dominant in the United States Supreme Court, they shouldn't be allowed to test.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting, Martha. So I'm an immigrant here, and I would say till 2016, I wasn't really race or gender conscious. So now everything is race and gender conscious.
Yeah.
And so any system that has improved for hundreds of years to a better and better situation could be destroyed in a matter of few years. So it is democracy in that sense is sort of brittle, isn't it? I don't know if it's an alternative.
It's brittle, but it's only because of a simplistic form of thinking. So, you know, you have the Chief Justice of the United States say the only way to overcome racial discrimination is to stop discriminating on the basis of race. I admire him, but I think that's simplistic thinking. If we have patterns that are racially biased, we have to be race conscious to overcome them. And the same thing that can be said about gender or disability. So I think a lot about how we design our physical spaces or even our schools, typically without having in mind that there's a student who has a disability. So we design them not to have access for someone who uses a wheelchair, or we rely on physical books for someone who can't turn the pages, or written text for someone who can't see the pages. There's no reason that we need to do that. We can open up learning, particularly with new technologies, to be accessible to people who have control of one voluntary muscle. And the question is, who's in mind for the designer when the designer is setting it up? And so from my point of view, having in mind all of the circumstances is absolutely critical. Otherwise, the building will define some people as disabled because they can't enter. Or some classrooms will define the person as disabled because they can't understand what's going on. Well, we could design it differently.
Yeah, so I was thinking, Martha, I don't know if it's the right way to think about it. So in a broader definition of disability, for instance, a child's initial conditions matter a lot. So, nutrition, we had an ex-president who said, I was just given $5 million and see what I have accomplished. It's a complete lack of understanding how humanity works, right? So initial conditions matter a lot for humans. I don't think there is an easy way to solve this problem. I'm just posing it. So disability could be in a much more broader context than what we can see, right? What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, I agree. And disadvantage can be understood as a bigger classification in which disability is one type, financial is another, being a member of a despised group is another. being born in some places as opposed to other places. If you genuinely believe that every human being has same dignity, same possibilities, then those are situations that are not simply misfortunes, they're injustices. And somebody once said a society advances when what was once thought to be a misfortune is now understood to be an injustice. And I think I'm sympathetic to that view. We're all temporarily able-bodied. As we age, we discover. And I think it should open up our empathy for anyone who seems to have such a disadvantage.
I'm going to quickly argue against myself for a minute. I'm just thinking about this. So we have seen the data that, let's say you take a country like India and you have, 26 different states. Some states get a lot more central assistance compared to others. And the development of the states that get higher central assistance, in other words, central assistance is sort of negatively correlated with development. And so sometimes actually having bad initial conditions could be quite an advantage in some ways. So it becomes a very complex thing. Yeah.
No, it sure is. And certainly having an ability to identify where resources should go. It's a problem right now the Biden administration has, for example, in trying to remedy environmental harms. And the Biden administration has come up with a formula that includes poverty and also the racial composition of the community. And why? Because there is demonstrated higher location of toxic dumps in communities with higher percentage of racial minorities. Some people would say, oh, well, I want to be in a community that's going to get the remediation. Well, actually, not when you look at the toxic stuff.
Right. Excellent. I know that you have to go. We went in a lot of different directions, but I really enjoyed the conversation.
I did as well. Thanks for the very good questions and the invitation.
Thanks, Martha.